Good morrow, One Lit teacher here. I'm very excited this morning because I get to talk about my favorite poem by my favorite poet. This is the Good-Morrow, a metaphysical poem by John Donne. I'm going to have to talk very quickly because there's a whole lot to say. The Good-Morrow is a mature love poem by John Donne, and it's written to his wife, Anne Moore. It's written in 3 stanzas, each of 7 lines, and each of those stanzas represents a phase in Donne's life. So very quickly, I'm going to do something very simplistic, and that is sort of oversimplify Donne's life. If we look at his early works, we might call Donne a rake. In this time period before Donne met Anne Moore, he was writing poems like The Flea and The Bait and song Go and Catch a Falling Star. He was a womanizer, and he wrote about the inconstancy of women, and he didn't believe that true love is possible. But after he met and married Anne Moore, he wrote poems about how love changed his life and his worldview, and this is one of those poems. Later on, after Donne converted to Anglicanism and became a minister, he wrote holy sonnets and other ecclesiastical works. And all 3 of those phases are really represented in this one poem. The poem is highly biographical and highly personal. The rhyme scheme is AB, AB, C, C, C. So each stanza has alternating rhyme in the first 4 lines and then concludes with a rhyming triplet. The meter is primarily iambic pentameter, but every stanza concludes with a line in iambic hexameter. So if you need to know about meter, I have another video on my YouTube channel, One Lit Teacher, about determining meter in poetry. But here, what I'm talking about is iambic meter, the most standard meter, 5 per line throughout most of the poem, and 6 in the concluding line of each stanza. There are a few change-ups, and I'll point at least one of those out to you on the next slide. The overall tone of the poem is one of awe and wonder, because it's as if Donne just truly cannot believe how childish he was in his past, how much he has changed, and how amazing that is. The theme of the poem is awakening to an enlightenment through this love that he has found. There are a few important terms that might help you understand the poem better. For example, good morrow, which I used in the first few moments of my discussion here. It's a greeting used in Elizabethan England, meaning good morning. 7 Sleepers is an allusion to a biblical story of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus. This is where 7 youths went into a cave in a world that wasn't yet Christian, and they emerged into what they thought of as truth, a Christian world. Alternately, it is also an allusion to Plato's allegory of the cave, and even though Donne specifically calls it 7 Sleepers' Den in line 4, I wanted to mention Plato because Plato's philosophies are part of John Donne's thinking, and they sort of are reflected in a number of his poems, even in this one, and I'll point some of that out to you a little bit later. Here I have marked some of the ideas that I've already mentioned. For example, let's get rid of, or get meter out of the way right away. I have marked that iambic pentameter. I wonder by my troth what thou and I did till we loved. Were we not weaned till then? So dee-dum, 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 dee-dum. This is Shakespeare's favorite meter, iambic pentameter. But he does conclude each stanza with iambic hexameter. For example, which I desired and got, 'twas but a dream of thee. And so that is 6 of those iambs. There are a few little change-ups. For example, in line 4, or snorted we in the 7 sleepers' den. There's a little change-up there. And that actually kind of goes along with the idea here that Donne is saying, boy, was I confused back then, and I didn't really see things clearly. It kind of goes along with that idea. Also, the rhetorical questions that are really heavily used in this first stanza help with that sort of initial tone of confusion, of not seeing things clearly and being uncertain. I wonder, by my troth, what thou and I did till we loved. Were we not weaned till then, but sucked on country pleasures childishly? Or snorted we in the 7 sleepers' den? And of course, rhetorical questions tie into that metaphysical aspect of argument. So a very highly used strategy by Donne. There are many rakish elements in the first stanza, like sucked and the repetition of pleasures, snorted. It's as if Donne is sort of childishly mixing the idea of breastfeeding with some sexual act. And also, though, he does end with this idea that this desire that he had for other women, whom, by the way, he got, that John Donne sort of signature arrogance is always there. It was just a dream of thee, he says to Anne Moore. Don't worry, I really wasn't seeing clearly then. And that ties in also to a sleep motif, which helps to build a transition between stanzas 1 and 2. That dream then becomes his waking soul and her waking soul in stanza 2 with that opening line. Here I've marked the transition, and now good morrow to our waking souls. So speaking of that transition, I've also marked the 3 different aspects or periods of John Donne's life, past, present, and future, as they are represented in the stanzas. It's very clear at the opening of stanza 2 that he's saying now, where we are now, our souls are wakening. And that's a beautiful idea. Here I've also marked some sound devices, alliteration and consonants. I'm going to go back and show how they tie into stanza 1 and then build a transition into stanza 2. So in stanza 1, there's a lot of alliteration with the W sounds, what, wonder, what, we, were, we, weaned, which kind of maybe goes along with the idea of breastfeeding and being a child. And then the S's, sucked, pleasures, childishly. The consonants just means it is that sound in the middle or the end of the word. This sort of has him in this sleepy phase where he's not seeing things clearly. The alliteration all but goes away in stanza 2. Which, watch, or love, which is a repetition, is really about all we can hear and see in stanza 2, because Donne is seeing things more clearly. Here repetition takes over, and the repeated words help us to see the clear theme of the poem. It is love that I've created with you, one world. That's all I need, this love. It's a beautiful idea. Also the microcosm in stanza 2 there in the 4th line, and makes a one little room and everywhere. All I need is this love in this room that I have with you, and that is all. That is my world. A beautiful idea. The other important sound device is anaphora, where the phrasing, the lines begin with the same word. Let sea discoverers to new worlds have gone. Let maps to other worlds on worlds have shown. Let us possess one world, each hath one and is one. And so that also really highlights the exploration motif. It is the Renaissance, after all. There's a lot of exploration and conquering going on. And here Donne is saying, I've already discovered the only world I need, and I've found it in you. So again, a really beautiful sentiment. In stanza 3, Donne uses a really complex rhetorical structure. It is chiasmus. And this structure is named after the Greek letter chi, which is an X. So I've drawn an X over that first line in stanza 3. My face in thine eye, thine in mine appears. You can see that the beginning of the line is a mirror image of the end of the line. And this reminds me of how Donne says in a valediction of weeping, how the two lovers, he and Anne, are coining each other in their tears. Here he's saying we are reflecting each other, and that's part of how we are one. So it's a beautiful idea, and it's also reinforced by the body motif, face, eye, hearts. He's saying we are one. And again, that's part of the number motif, which I can trace back to stanza 2, with the word one being repeated a number of times. And then in stanza 2, it becomes 2. So 1 and 1 are 2, which is part of the beautiful message of this poem. Another just idea about sound devices is that while there's not a lot of alliteration in stanza 3, there is some assonance or assonance, and that is that long I sound that comes in that first line in stanza 3. Thine eye, thine, mine, which also just helps us to see them blending smoothly into one another. There is an alchemy reference here after the rhetorical question. He says, where can we find two better hemispheres without sharp north, without declining west? That exploration idea, we needn't look any further. And then whatever dies was not mixed equally. So the idea of alchemy is a popular one of the day, and Donne kind of ties it into the search for eternal life here, which also ties into the Platonic soul idea that he brings in the last line of the poem. And so they will not die because they are mixed equally. They sort of complete each other. If our two loves be one, or thou and I love so alike that none do slacken, none can die. This idea that Plato had, that the soul is not bound to the body and it will live without the body, Donne ties into the idea that they are one and they will live on together. It also helps me to see stanza 3 as sort of a projection of the future that Donne sees with his wife. So even after they no longer exist physically, they will still be one. And so this is sort of a fusion of the physical and the spiritual, which is another one of those cornerstone metaphysical aspects. Here is a smaller version of the poem, and I'm going to use this already marked version to talk about a few questions that you might have about the poem. What is metaphysical about the poem? And again, if you need a little primer on metaphysical poetry, I have one on my channel, One Lit Teacher. But this poem has an abstract presence in it, and it is the presence of and more. It is an extended apostrophe. So this is a metaphysical presence. She's not really there, but she is there. The poem has some argumentative strategies or rhetorical strategies, and that's typical of metaphysical poetry. There is, as I mentioned, a fusing of the physical and the spiritual, and there is a use of contemporary scientific thought as well as some philosophical concepts. So contemporary science, exploration, alchemy, and some of the ideas of Plato, which obviously are much older than John Donne, but remember it's the Renaissance where all things ancient Greek are really in vogue among the elite educated class. What else about this poem is signature Donne? So in other words, if you study the works of John Donne, how does this poem sort of typify those works? Well, that 3-stanza structure I see in a number of John Donne poems is used here. Also, just the idea that Donne is so complex in his patterns that even numbers tie in, like 3 representing a trinity, the religion of love idea, or 7 being a perfection number, and those ideas are sometimes even replicated in the rhyme scheme, for example, or the stanzaic form. The poem is starkly honest and personal, and that is very much like other poems of John Donne. Here, Donne brings in the religion of love. He does that in his rakish poems in sort of a crass, blasphemous way. Here, he does it in a way that is lovely and brings religion and love together in the idea of true love. He also uses the Ptolemaic view here, if you think about it, because she is the center of his universe. And that means that the sun is not the center, and that's a debate going on at the time. Donne also uses the device of microcosm here, which is one that he likes to use in a lot of his other poems, for example, like The Flea, which I discuss in another video on my YouTube channel, One Lit Teacher. This poem is a beautiful poem by John Donne, and it also gives us the opportunity to think about how universal John Donne's poetry really is. So while it is really representing a lot of Renaissance worldviews and ideas that are bound to the Renaissance, it also brings up a lot of current global issues. For example, ideas that tie into culture, identity, and community, ideas about how religion and sexuality form our place in society and how they shape our thinking, as well as how science and technology shape our place in the world and how they tie into the way that we look at the world and our relationships within it. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you will subscribe to my YouTube channel, One Lit Teacher, for other videos about poetry in general, about the poetry of John Donne and Shakespeare, and other matters of literature. Thank you.